in Sumatra, you have the arrival of the pavilion and the longhouse. So the idea of the chieftain sitting on the pile of rocks or the raised platform was then converted into a longhouse. The roof, a shade structure, was built over the chompang. To me, the platforms are everything. The roof is just a temporary structure, as it was for the Mayans. If you look at all of the Mayan ruins, you've got to just try and imagine timber structures like this on them. And each of those posts belongs to sort of like a clan chief of the Sumatrans, who are rather like the Scottish and also very, very braveheart. On the other side of that longhouse, where the thatch is from the sugar palm, which was confiscated by your delightful customs authorities, and it is from a tree that grows taller than the coconut, so it's used for temples. It's always that animistic thing about the link between nature. It's not just worshipping nature, it's the way you look at nature and access nature. And I tried to use that in the garden design in Naples. So because they're chieftains, they're allowed to, they and only they are allowed to use the black ejuk, thatch. On the other side is a giant body of water, probably from the South Indian tradition of tanks, which is a very important introduction, as the tradition of the Persian garden with its rills and its cascades was carried into northern Africa and up into southern Europe, Spain in particular, Andalusia, the wonderful Alhambra, eventually up and influencing the Dutch water garden specialist, Le Notre, over to Connecticut, you know. There was a direction the other way too. So from Persia it went up into Central Asia, to Isfahan, over to Mughal India. The most famous one that survives is in Shalimar. The famous Guerlain perfume is named after that famous scented garden, perfume garden. And then down into Cambodia, which is particularly famous, Angkor Wat, Angkor Thom, the city, which was at its time the biggest city in the world, had vast tanks and floating pavilions on them. This is the inspiration for the Chandi ruin, the ruinscape I've done in Naples. But this is the sort of the terrace sanctuary after a layer of classical Hindu decorative art is laid over it. This was the last temple built during the Hindu era before the arrival of Islam in Java. The Majapahit king Wijaya went up into the hills near Solo, central Java, where Gunung Merapi is exploding at the moment. Merapi, as the Fox News calls it. And achieved moksha at this temple, once with the Godhead. He was a holy king. And as Islam had swept into his father's court, and there was a lot of duplicity. But anyway, there's a whole story behind this Chandi, so it shows that. It looks a bit Mayan. You can see that it's sort of descended from the ancient Asian gardens. And the great archaeologist Bernard Kempfer said that in this temple, and only in this temple, did the king return to the aboriginal motifs of Java. And you can say the same about the aboriginal motifs of, say, Vietnam without Chinese influence. South Korea has the same thing. The crouched figures, the Venuses, fertility symbols. The idea of the temple on the lake. Excuse me, let's get a bit of water. This is the famous Badugu Lake, Chandi Kuning, which is now a tourist trap. But in the age of the Rajas, these South Indian traditions of the symbolic Mount Meru and the eternal ocean. So many of those South Indian temples, and the idea sweeping down to Java and Cambodia, derive from that tradition, classical Hindu traditions. Whoop. Trade had a lot to do with the way decorative garden traditions were adopted, adapted, absorbed. The Moorish tradition, that from the 9th, 10th century onwards, of course, the Indian traders started in the 4th century, and they were looking from Gujarat, they were looking for the famous sandalwood of East Indonesia. And they didn't have any metal implements, so they were bringing axes and things and trading for the sandalwood. They also bought the textile, the Gujarati double ikat textile. So all of that Indonesian textile is descended from the early Gujarati traders, called ikat. And also the Moorish traders then started looking for spices, cinnamon and nutmeg from Banda. I mean, Christopher Columbus was looking for Banda Island, a tiny island. Little Banda was swapped between the Dutch and the English for Manhattan, which is a wonderful side story that relates to Southeast Asian garden history, because Banda was the center of world commerce, and it's just a speck in the Spice Islands. And for years, the Arab traders had dominated the spices, which they needed in Egypt and North Africa for their curries. And then, of course, it became necessary to cure the corned beef for the Napoleon's troops, for example, to fight on in later centuries. But this nutmeg was terribly important. So we had this Moorish influence in the gardens. This could be a sort of derivative of Alhambra. It's the palace of the king of Jogja. It's called the Taman Sari, the fragrant water palace. It's very special. And this is probably now under 10 inches of lahar, volcanic ash mixed with rainwater. It's a bit like Pompeii at the moment in poor old Yogyakarta, which is a city of 4 million people. Now, after this sort of era of the Chinese and the Arab traders and the Indians, the Indian pilgrim priests, you had quite a solid period of the age, what I call the age of the Rajas, and the decorative traditions became very sophisticated. So the Balinese were doing these sort of Chinese-inspired red brick from Majapahit from Java, because the Hindu landscape and architectural traditions from Java, which was called the mother culture, the golden era of classic Javanese Hinduism, swept into Bali. The priests, many of the princes came to Bali, and this was one of the great works of the Raja of Lombok, the island next to Bali, called Taman Mayura. It's got a mind of its own, this remote. Of course, the colonial era too. And it was generally through the courts, the dissemination of Islam was through the courts. The dissemination of these sort of English landscape, Dutch, Shishi, statuary sort of traditions from which the country will never recover, were disseminated through the courts. This is the beautiful palace in Solo, very near Yogyakarta. But still, the mysticism of the Indian garden was maintained. There are exactly 81 choco trees, because it was a very important Buddhist number. The culture of Indonesia is very much Shiva and Buddha, Shiva Buddhism, Hindu Buddhism. And in the colonial era, there were such beautiful gardens in Java. I'm tending to use my images from Java and Bali because I live there and because they are my best images, but it was very similar in Burma, and in Thailand, of course, was not colonized, but it adopted French traditions in their gardens. So there's more strange little bonsais and things happening in Thailand until recent times, until Bill Bensley got into the groove. But East Java really had these wonderful estates with incredible parklands. Now, the Rajas were not averse to doing, while the kings and the courts and their gardens in Europe were doing chinoiserie dining rooms, and they'd have little, in Shanti has a Chinese dining room, but I'm thinking of the famous Japanese garden in Courance, Chateau Courance outside Paris, which is a La Notre garden, originally a Dutch water garden, because the Dutch apparently introduced the water gardens into France. But in the Rajas of Asia were doing these sort of European oiserie, formal gardens with arbors and statuary, and they're trying to, this was 1940s, but it looks like something from the 18th century. The Tirthaganga, the Ganges water in East Bali, the kings of East Bali and Lombok, but particularly adept at landscape design. And then came the war, the 50s and the 60s, the Hawaiian tradition, Belt Collins. Everyone used Belt Collins for all of those hotels in Penang, in Bali. This was the Bali Beach, a war reparation gift from the Japanese. I redid this garden in the 80s. But it was extremely popular, the Hawaiian tradition of the artful natural, which had come from the English, mixed with the idea of the sort of kon-tiki and the little bits of tiki-tack sort of culture. A little bit